Hey guys, welcome to the channel. As you see in the thumbnail, what if Deku was in high school DXD? Before I start, please do support for more awesome content and subscribe my channel and like this video and also share this video with your friends. I have created my other videos playlist, there you can watch my all videos easily, check out as well. Let's start this video. The death of Yagi Toshinori, or All Might as a large majority of the world knew him, was one that elicited a reaction from everybody. Even despite the fact that his battle with All For One had rendered him incapable of using the powers that made him to the forefront of the world's attention in the first place, people still reacted. Now, these reactions varied in nature, some mourned the death of the man that kept villains in the shadows by name alone, others rejoiced at the casting off of an oppressive chain, but the fact still remained, his death had caused the entire world to react. For Midioriya Izuku, however, the young teen who All Might had chosen to inherit his power, one for all, and subsequently, the mantle of the symbol of peace, the news of Toshinori's death, had hit him particularly hard. Of course it had. Not to sound cocky, but in terms of being close to the deceased party, he had a firm belief that not a single person surpassed him. Izuku didn't know when it happened, but at some point, All Might stopped being the goal, the ideal, the person he was trying to fill the shoes of. At some point, All Might simply stopped being All Might to him and simply became the man, Yagi Toshinori, a close friend and confidant who, unfortunately, had succumbed to the same fate that everyone else would eventually have to face. It was safe to say that many tears were spilled from his eyes after he heard the news. He was 16 at the time, so of course, the man's absence didn't sit well with him at all. The lingering sadness that he felt didn't cripple him though, nor did it weigh him down. No, actually, it had quite the opposite effect. The next symbol of peace couldn't afford to waste time wallowing in despair, after all. He had already known that fact long beforehand, but after, it just became all the more apparent. So, what did he do? He didn't. Though, looking back on it, maybe that did more bad than it did good. Izuku was 17 now, and a lot of things about his life were different. First off, he was 100% sure that he was no longer in his own world anymore. Where was he now? How was he sure it was a different world? How did something like that even happen? Well, right now, he was currently standing in the bathroom of his small, Kuo-town apartment, the one that he had been forced to rent and find a job to pay for, not that he really minded, as it gave him something to do with his spare time, when he woke up in this world without any form of support. In regards to how the inheritor of One for All knew he was currently in a completely different world to his own, the fact that none of the people in this world still used the old definition of the word quirk in the internet, knew not of the kind he spoke of, told him as much. Though having been told as much outright by the being that sent him there did help in that regard. Now, when it came to how exactly he ended up in this different world to begin with, that was something he wasn't so sure of. All he knew was that it involved a certain event that he will forever refer to as it, and a meeting with a giant red dragon in a place that it called the Dimensional Gap. To put things simply, the dragon decided to bring him to this world for whatever reason. It hadn't given him the luxury of specifying why or enough time to ask. It just sort of spoke to him for a second, gave him the very basics of what was going to happen to him, and then promptly sent him on his way with a painful smack of its giant tail, something that still irked him to this day. All of that had happened 7 months ago, and the hero in training was happy to say that, after all of the initial emotions, none of which good, that coursed through him after finding out that he was, in fact, in a completely other world, he was finally beginning to adjust to his new life situation. Sure, he still missed all of the people he was close with back in his original world, but the same lesson that he was reminded of when Toshinori had passed applied here. The next symbol of peace couldn't afford to waste time wallowing in his despair. Besides, it wasn't like it was something that he could just come back from anyway. Turning the cold water faucet on his sink, Izuku quickly poured some of the ice-cold liquid in the makeshift bowl he made with his hands and quickly splashed some on his face to expel the thoughts from his mind. The last thing he could afford to do was give in to his still very troublesome habit of allowing his thoughts overtake him and, consequently, lose track of time, especially on today of all days. Today was his first day at a new school, after all, and, despite the title no longer meaning anything in this world, he was sure that the next symbol of peace shouldn't be late to school for whatever reason. Drying his face off with one of the 2 towels that he could afford to pay for, Izuku stepped out of his bathroom and into the room that served as his dining area, living room and bedroom. Yep, it was true. His new accommodations were far from being the most spacious, but it was all that he could afford at the time being with his current job salary, even with the discount his landlord had been so gracious enough to allot to him. That was the problem with the only jobs being available to him, as a teenager only paying minimum wage, he supposed. Still, he was grateful for all that he had right now, as meager as it was. Every little thing that he had in this room, he earned by himself. Nothing, absolutely nothing was given to him. Alright, okay, so he definitely had a little help along the way, but that didn't change the fact that he earned those things. It just changed how he ended up earning those things. Walking over to in-wall closet in which he kept all of his clothing related items, which in relation to his front door was located in the far corner of his small apartment, he took the towel he had been using to dry his face and folded it into a neat little square. Before placing it down next to the closet door. Sliding the closet door open, the inheritor of One for All began to search for the school uniform of the school he had chosen to go to due to its proximity to his home. Upon finding it, he pulled out all the items that made the uniform up and went to work putting it all on a simple process overall. Took him about 10 minutes total, and when he was finished he went over to his fridge, which was really just a mini fridge with a separated top half meant for frozen items, and pulled from it a plate of leftovers from last night's dinner. He was going to have to eat it cold. He didn't have the luxury of a microwave, so he really didn't have a choice in the matter. Only a few thousand yen more. Izuku thought to himself with a longing sigh as he glanced over at the glass jar filled with loose change that sat on top of his fridge. He ate another spoonful of cold food and let out a whimper. Only a few thousand more. Pushing his want for a microwave to the back of his mind, he glanced over at the alarm clock that sat next to his bedroll to gauge how much time he had until school started. He partially expected there to be only a few more minutes left before he would be late for school, but instead, it showed that the former hero in training had ample enough time to get where he needed to go. One of the benefits of getting up so early, I suppose, Izuku thought to himself idly, all the while shoveling more food into his mouth. Though, maybe 4 in the morning is a bit too early. Yeah, I can probably afford to push it up a half an hour or so. Finally finishing the rest of his food, he put his plate down into his kitchen sink and began washing. He finished in a record 30 seconds, and when he was done, he made sure to put the now clean plate on the drying rack nearby. After doing so, he turned around and leant his back against the counter, letting out a tired sigh as he did so. He stayed like that for a while, green eyes scanning the room in which he called home, before he eventually had to pry himself from the thoughts that swirled in his head. He still had school to get to, after all. Moving toward his front door, he slipped a pair of white and green sneakers and opened it, having to undo the lock and deadbolt before doing so. Stepping outside, the former hero in training took an over-the-shoulder glance back inside his apartment. He stayed like that for a moment, maybe two, before eventually shaking his head and taking a step outside toward his new school life. Izuku stared out at the classroom he'd be spending the rest of his high school career in and couldn't help the tremble in his legs. Never in his life had he seen a sight more terrifying, and he's had to fight many supervillains in the past. For a little context, Kuo Academy was once an all-girls school, keyword being was. Recently, the powers that ran the school began to allow male students to enroll and partake in classes. That being the case, the school still had a population made out of mostly female students. Now, normally, the inheritor of One for All would have thought better of enrolling in a school of mostly women due to his still present, difficulties in handling the opposite gender, especially ones that leaned more toward the attractive side of the spectrum. Which seemed very abundant at this school for whatever reason, but it was the only school that was in close proximity to both his apartment and workplace, so he was kind of going to have to deal with it for the time being. Besides, it wasn't like he was the most eye-catching guy in the world in terms of looks, so he doubted that he'd draw too much attention in the first place. Sure, he wasn't the worst-looking guy in the world, but he was far from being a head-turner. He had always looked a lot more boyish than he did masculine, from his face to inferior height. He had none of the physical features that most women thought to be attractive, or at least. He hoped that was the case. He'd like to have his next 2 school years be as stutter-free as possible. One might think that, after having faced full-blown, out-for-blood supervillains, that the former hero in training would be more resilient to the gazes of a few women, but that person would be dead wrong. Sure, a few 1 or 2 he'd be able to handle, but an entire classroom. Nope, not ever in a million years. He would be reduced to a blubbering mess of incoherent mutterings and uncontrollable tremors in a matter of seconds. My name is Midioriya Izuku, he began to introduce himself to his new classmates, his voice shaky as he bowed his head sharply. Please take care of me. The inheritor of One for All felt a bead of sweat begin to run down his forehead when he began to hear the class in front of him start to whisper to one another, doing so at so low a volume that what they were saying was incoherent to him. Oh, I can already tell that this was a bad decision. When the bell for lunch break sounded, Izuku found himself stumped as to what to do. He would go and get some lunch from the cafeteria, but unfortunately, the food here at Kuo wasn't free like it was at UA. And due to his want for a microwave, he didn't have any money to spare to buy a snack or anything. At most, he'd be able to go to a vending machine and buy a soft drink to help tide him over until later when he was at work. Sorry. Midoriya-kun, was it? The sound of a feminine voice calling out to him drew the young man from his budget-driven reverie. Looking up towards where it came from, he found that a rather attractive-looking girl was the one to talk to him. There wasn't anything about her appearance that he found to be really outstanding or defining, though. Rather, everything about her was average light brown hair with a light dusting of makeup, dark brown eyes, heart-shaped face, and a perfectly average body, but it was almost as if all of these ordinary things worked in perfect coordination with one another to help elevate their quality overall. Truly, he didn't know what someone as pretty as herself was doing talking to someone like himself. Do you mind stopping that muttering, I mean. Not to make you feel bad or anything like that, but you're starting to freak people out. Eyes wide and body thoroughly frozen from the revelation that was just dropped onto him, a thought ran through his mind as he tried processing the words just spoken to him. Green eyes scanning the room around him, he found that the girl's statement was, in fact, correct. The amount of girls staring at him with frightened looks was astonishing. It made him want to shrivel up into a little ball and disappear from sheer embarrassment. Sorry, he muttered back in reply, though he would describe it as more of a whimper really, and angled his head down to face the surface of his desk. If he could, he'd run out of the classroom right now and find a little corner of the school to sulk and ruminate in for the rest of break, but he knew that it only served to exacerbate his current problem. So, he kept himself silent and continued to stare down at his desk, all the while hoping for the girl to leave so he could sit where he was and sulk and ruminate at his desk instead of some random corner of school. The unknown girl blinked at him and stared at him curiously for a grueling moment before smiling and exclaiming loudly, "Alright, thank you for being so understanding." Once the girl bounded off to where she originally came from, the hero in training let out a relieved sigh and allowed his body to relax once he felt all of the eyes leave him. Ah, man, that was stressful. He raised his head and allowed a smile to form on his lips as he thought that, but I managed to navigate my way through that without too much trouble somehow. I suppose that I should be grateful for that. Then, right as he thought he was done with one problem, his original one reared its ugly head in a low, yet still very audible grumble. He was just lucky that everyone was so wrapped up in their current conversations that his body's crying out for sustenance went unnoticed. Laying his chin onto the surface of the desk, Izuku allowed another thought to run through his head, one much less positive one. I think that it's probably best to go find a vending machine now. Izuku accomplished his mission easily enough. All he really had to do was go down to the cafeteria and look around the general area for one that wasn't already occupied by a group of girls, which he did, though doing so involved him having to go behind the cafeteria. Wait, isn't this thing's placement a little counterintuitive? He asked himself as he took quick glances to his left and right, noting just how empty the area really was as he put a 100 note into the corresponding slot. Wouldn't this machine be more effective in an easier to access area? Shrugging to himself, the former hero in training picked a drink and waited for it to drop down into where he'd be able to pick it up so he could quell the incessant growling in his stomach. As he did, the sound of someone heading in his general direction hit his ears. Drink now in hand and body turning to where the noise was coming from, the former hero in training found himself staring at an approaching brown-haired boy, his head being firmly lodged within the contents of some sort of magazine. Yeah, from what Izuku could tell from where he was standing, it was most definitely a magazine. A magazine, huh? The frizzy-haired young man began as he cracked open the can in his hand. He took a sip of the fizzy peach-flavored drink in his hand before his eyes suddenly widened. A comic book maybe. Over the years, a lot of things about Izuku have changed, but the one thing that hadn't been his love for heroes, which of course meant that he also loved comic books, a fact that only made itself more apparent in a world that had no such thing as heroes in it. So, as the unknown boy walked by him, the inheritor of One for All made sure to keep his eyes firmly planted onto the article in his hands, a mistake that he paid dearly for when he saw what kind of magazine it actually was. Before he could stop it, a cry of shock rang out from Izuku's throat, an act that immediately drew the boy's attention as he too jumped in fright, which caused him to throw the article of paper he was holding into the air and directly onto the former hero in training's face, inside down. The boy standing in front of Izuku let out an awkward chuckle as he glared. "Oh come on, I said I was sorry, didn't I?" the brown-haired boy asked as he scratched at the back of his scalp. The young man who was once known as Deku took in a deep breath through his nostrils, hoping that the intake of air would direct some of the blood that had pooled in his cheeks elsewhere. He shook his head and took a glance down at his left hand, the hand that, inside it, held the offending item. "You and I both know that isn't the problem here." There was a brief moment of silence as the unknown boy took his eyes off the former hero in training and onto the cafeteria wall to their right. That silence didn't last very long, however, as the prior snapped his head back onto him and exclaimed, "Oh come on, man. Let me have my magazine back." "No." Izuku immediately denied. Why did you bring something like this to school to begin with? Are you kidding me? You're a guy too, aren't you? You should understand why I need to bring something like that to school. I mean, just look around you. There's water everywhere, and there isn't a single drop to grope. Deku could only stare at the boy before him with a bewildered look, simply not knowing how to respond to what was just said. Huh? What are you? Boobs, man? What else would I be talking about? Why else would a man enroll into a former all-female school if not for all the boobs? For several moments after the boy uttered that absurdity, the world became silent. Izuku, not being able to comprehend the sheer perversion put behind the statement, simply stared at its speaker with a look of incredulity so intense and powerful that it could probably fall to an All Might in his prime. Never in his life. Never in his life. Never in his life did he ever expect to find a boy as perverted as his sticky ball-covered friend Mineta. He was wrong. Very clearly, he was wrong with that assumption. Oh, so very wrong. Finding that he no longer had the energy to argue against a boy in front of him, the former hero in training simply held the illicit magazine out towards the young man in question. He knew better than to try and fight back against such a force. It was a near unstoppable force, the will of a hormone-driven teenage pervert. To try and argue against it was like trying to get an apology out of Kakin, an impossible task unless extreme measures were taken. His sudden surrender must have confused a brown-haired boy as he simply blinked at the offered hand and stared at it for a while, looking perplexed. It seemed that he wasn't used to people being so accepting of his peculiarities. What? You aren't going to lecture me, hit me, or anything for having this on me? Izuku couldn't help but blink in response to the question. What? No. Why would I ever do something like that? Sure, this he looked down at the magazine in his hand for a second before looking back up at him, might be more than a little inappropriate to have at school of all places, but doing something like those last two he started to scratch at the back of his head. Isn't that a little excessive? The stranger stared at the inheritor of One for All for several seconds, his expression being one of subtle bewilderment, an expression that didn't stay subtle for very long as it suddenly turned into a teary-eyed smile. Are you alright? Deku couldn't help but ask that question as he looked at the suddenly crying boy. Oh? Sorry about that, the aforementioned boy exclaimed rather excitedly as he used his blazer sleeve to wipe the tears from his eyes. Once he was done, he looked back up at the frizzy-haired hero in hiding and asked, "Anyway, you're new here, right?" "Yes, how did you?" "Oh, don't worry. I'm not stalking you or anything." The unknown boy let out an awkward chuckle as he too began to scratch at the back of his head. "I'm actually in your class." "Really? Sorry, but I don't remember seeing you." "Ah, it's alright. You seemed pretty nervous during your introduction, so I don't really blame you for not noticing." Izuku couldn't help but laugh a little at the sudden reference of his earlier embarrassment. It was that obvious, huh? It was kind of hard not to, man. You were literally shaking the entire time. Anyway, seeing that you're a new student, I'm assuming you don't have many friends here, right? Izuku, already knowing where this was going, blinked and began nodding his head hesitantly. Then, how about the two of us be friends? The former hero could only stare at the hand brought to him after the boy said that, unsure on what exactly to do. And that was the story as to how Midoriya, Izuku and Haidu became friends, despite their many differences, something that the former was being reminded of right now, believe it or not. There they were, sitting at their usual lunch spot behind the cafeteria, by the vending machine in which they first met one another, chatting idly as they consumed their lunches. Well, really, only one of them ate their lunch, as the one of them who had to pay for his food, due to himself being his only source of income, was still saving up a fund to purchase a microwave. Closer and closer, anyway, what they were currently talking about irked the one-time hero greatly, though he was, gradually, getting better at handling it than the first time it was brought up. That topic? It was Issei's dream. The one thing the boy wanted more than anything else. To be a harem king, which, at first, didn't tell Izuku much about his newest friend other than that he wanted to be with multiple women, a terrible and immoral dream, but not one he couldn't understand. He was a hormonal, teenage male, after all, but that was before the pervert went into graphic detail as to why. Very graphic detail. Too graphic of detail. Every day, if the frizzy-haired teen didn't actively steer the conversation away into another direction. It was now safe to state that the inheritor of the One for All was beginning to develop a tolerance for such things. Still, having to hear his friend go on and on about feminine body parts was definitely not the most comfortable experience for him. He spent most of time flustered to high holy as mental images kept popping up in his head. Despite that discomfort though, Izuku couldn't say that he disliked talking to his friend. Sure, he wasn't someone who was easy to displease, and Issei was probably the crudest lewdest person he's ever met outside of Mineta. The race for top slot was getting closer as the days went by though, but that wasn't the point. He thoroughly enjoyed speaking with the fellow second year, even if the topics that were being discussed made him uncomfortable. Deku's enjoyment could probably be heavily attributed to the fact Issei was just like himself in a way. He too had a dream that, even in the face of sheer impossibility, he wanted to reach, and that dream just led him to talk about rather embarrassing things. It was just like the former hero, and his love for researching quirks in a way. Sure, the motivations were very different from one another, but he couldn't deny that a similarity was there, and he couldn't help but enjoy hearing someone speak about a topic with such similar passion. So, that's why Tripal X-chan's boobs are the best in the entirety of all the first years. Issei stated with much finality. Like always, Izuku had to block out the name of the girl being referred to save some of her reputation. What do you think, Izuku? I honestly can't say that I've paid too much attention, the once hero in training began to say, but he was cut off before he could finish his stuttering statement. Haven't been paid too much, are you kidding me, man? The brown-haired boy groaned loudly as he put another piece of food in his mouth. He clicked his tongue out of irritation. You really got to live a little more. Take a peek into the girls' locker room every once in a while with me, Mitsuda and Motohama. Suddenly, Izuku's face shifted into one of a deep glare. You're seriously still peeking in on the girls? He asked, not being able to believe his brown-haired friend. I'm telling you, you're going to get caught eventually. How do you keep doing that? Issei yelled out, flinching backwards dramatically as he did so, holding his hands up to protect himself. What he was referring to had become an inside joke in between the two of them. The once hero in training, being someone who used to combat super-powered criminals, had grown used to turning serious at a moment's notice, which, apparently, freaked out his perverted friend greatly. Probably because he would switch from flustered to dead serious. Anyway, didn't I already tell you? Being able to peek inside there, no matter what punishment the girls give us, is totally worth it. Actually, no, what am I saying? Boobs are always worth it. Well, the inheritor of One for All started, trailing off before he let out an exasperated sigh. Alright. He shook his head. Just don't get yourself hurt. Stop worrying, man. I appreciate the concern, but trust me when I say that everything's going to be fine. Well, so much for everything's going to be fine, I guess, Izuku thought to himself as he gazed at the chaos that was erupting around his brown-haired friend from afar, shaking his head disbelievingly as he did so. Briefly, he wondered if he should save his friend from the punishment that the kendo club, the club that the perverted trio had been performing on, was set to deal him, but thought better of it. Not to say that he particularly liked the sight of Issei getting his face bashed in, but the boy did bring what was coming on to himself. Sorry Issei, but I warned you about doing something like this. At the very least, I'll take you to the infirmary once the kendo club is done with you. The day was supposed to be Izuku's one of 2 days off from work, and instead of relaxing at home or taking a dent out of the pile of schoolwork he still needed to finish doing like he probably should be, he was out in the city, up on a roof doing something that came very naturally to him. Being a hero. Though, if one wanted to get more technical, he was being a vigilante. Now, unlike his original world, Kuo Town wasn't bursting to the seams with supervillain activity. It wasn't even bustling with criminal activity for that matter. For the most part, it was an average town whose only real problem was the occasional robbery performed by everyday street thugs. So, most days, he rarely had to go out and take on the moniker of Deku once again. A part of wished that things were different, but that part of him was quickly squashed when he remembered that there being no crime that warranted his attention was actually a good thing. Today, however, wasn't really a normal one. There was something big going on in the downtown section of town. He could tell from the chatter from his police scanner, the predecessor to his oh-so-desired microwave, in terms of having to save money in glass jars. Armed robbery of a bank. That was what was being discussed by the local police as they scrambled to get bodies out to start rectifying the problem. He didn't get the amount of robbers that were inside the bank before he suited up and started heading over towards the bank, but he did manage to catch the number of hostages inside. There were about 30 of them, so citizens inside the bank total when the action began. That meant there were 30 lives he needed to hurry and save. The former hero in training wasn't disappointed when he first reached the bank in question. The first things that struck him about the place was that it was fairly large and that it looked very modern in terms of architecture. Why did this strike him? Well, seeing that time most definitely wasn't on his side, he decided to make his explanation as quick and concise as possible. The bank was large, but not in the normal sense. A section of building that sat just above the first level and pointed up towards the sky was meaningless filler meant to make the building look good all the way to its pointed top. He could tell from all the glass panes that spanned just over its public entrance. That meant he only had one floor of thugs to deal, which he was thankful for. Multiple levels just made rescue missions more complicated, and that could get people killed. Alright, point of entry is going to have be front entrance, he noted to himself as he readied himself for what was to come, most importantly slipping his old mask over his head, something he didn't have to do a lot of back in his old world, as most everyone had a quirk. So keeping a secret identity wasn't really needed anymore. Here, things were different. A quirk like One for All, even only at 5%, would blow minds and garner unwanted attention. So, the impossibly large grin and the pointed, rabbit-esque ears of his mask were an unfortunate necessity. The robbers, if they have a shred of competency, most likely have someone guarding the back and entrances, so I most likely have no other choice in the matter anyway. His green eyes, hidden underneath the veil of his mask, shifted up to the tippy top of the glass window at the front entrance. Alright, through there. Once I'm in, use One for All at 5% on criminals, use One for All 20% to move around. Time limit is a minute. Police will most likely rush in after hearing initial gunshots. He took a deep breath and allowed himself to grin toothily before activating his handed-down quirk and launched himself towards the earlier mentioned infiltration point. Let's do this. If he had to thank that red dragon who brought him for anything, he would probably choose to thank it for taking him to another universe with his hero costume on. It would have been a pain to have to go and make his own or wear cheap equivalents to them. Not to say what he looked like to the public when he was out being a hero mattered a lot to him, but he did at least appreciate not having to look like a bum during his establishing years, just like a lot of the heroes in comics these days. It really helped with opinion in the public eye. Landing on the top of his apartment building's rooftop, Izuku reached up and ripped his mask off, revealing the sweat-drenched face that had hid away from the world's prying eyes. Literally gasping for air at that moment due to doing so much physical exertion in a short time period, he kicked himself for not having designed a mask that was a little more breathable. Still, despite his apparent exhaustion, there was still a smile on his currently gasping lips. Surprisingly enough, everything went according to plan today. He rushed in and smashed clean through the window, moved so quickly that the criminals could barely interact, and took them all down before anyone got hurt. He even managed to do it all in less than a minute, leaving out the back employee entrance right before he heard the police storm the building. Turns out there were 10 or so thugs in the bank, all of which having firearms, a sign that most likely meant that they might have some ties with the Yakuza, as guns were notoriously hard to get in Japan due to anti-firearm laws, and the Yakuza had a firm grasp on the black market in the area. He doubted that any of the men inside the bank were actually Yakuza, as they usually specialized in crime that wasn't attention-grabbing like robbing a bank. Today's robbers most likely just bought the guns from them at some point. I really need to find a way to get in contact with someone from the black market, the former hero in training told himself as he leaned his head back to look up at the night sky, which, due to Kuo Town's light pollution, wasn't filled with beautiful, dazzling stars. He did see a few poking through, but they just ended up reminding him of what was really up there in space. So, how exactly does a high school teen get into contact with the black market Yakuza? Back inside his apartment after a tiring half an hour, Izuku emerged from his bathroom after having taken a shower. Being mainly naked, the only thing that kept him from being completely done was the towel that he wrapped around his waist. Using his hand to shake any excess water from his hair, the young man quickly went over to where he had left his phone, a cheap flipping one that he got on sale, as he signed the contract to check if anyone called him while he was out. Sure enough, he got a text from Issei reading, "Dude, I did it. I got a GF. She's pretty, and her boobs are huge too. Call me and I'll be sure to tell you how it all went down. One step closer to Harem King. Woo." Actually, the text message didn't read like that at all. Izuku just translated it back to coherent English after reading it. There were grammar and spelling errors all over the place, but he could understand if Issei had been so excited at the prospect of getting a girlfriend that caring about such things was impossible for him. Still, good for Issei, though. He was being given an opportunity to reach for his dreams. Hopefully, he'll be able to capitalize on it like the inheritor of One for All had. Wait, wouldn't him having a harem just mean that he'd be sleeping around with multiple women? Shouldn't he, as his friend, try and stop the boob aficionado before one of them decides to kill him? It turns out that, on the day that he got caught peeping into the girls' locker room as the kendo club was changing, Issei got confessed to by a girl named Yuma as he was walking back home. Izuku couldn't help but laugh at his perverted friend's change in fortune. To think one could go from getting beat up by a bunch of women with kendo sticks to suddenly having a girl confess her feelings to him. It was absolutely mind-boggling to even think about. So Izuku began, as he glanced over at his friend in question, the both of them sitting at their usual spot. "When are you two going to see each other?" "Oh. Issei, like a child finding out they're going to get a new toy, perked up in response to his question. This Saturday. I seriously can't wait, man. Chuckling at his friend's excitement, the former hero in training turned his attention back to out in front of him, a small smile on his lips. Well, I wish you luck then. If I could, I'd offer you some advice, but I don't really have much experience with don't worry about it. I'm fine with knowing that you think of me as some kind of traitor. Traitor? Why would I? He began curiously before his entire face fell into a completely serious countenance. Oh yeah. Mitsuda and Motohama. I forgot about them. Yeah, Issei replied, scratching at the back of his head as he too chuckled awkwardly. They got on me pretty hard earlier. It's fine though. He shrugged his shoulders nonchalantly. I'm sure that they'll come around to the idea eventually. Just need to give them some time. I'm sure they will. Anyway, enough about me. How was your day yesterday? Did you spend it working again? No, it was my day off. I actually spent most of it relaxing and doing chores. Oh yeah, I forgot. Issei took a bite out of his lunch, a small loaf of yakisoba bread. You live on your own, right? Chewing, he added, wait, does that mean you work because you need to pay your rent and stuff? Ah, yeah, Izuku replied, chuckling to himself a little afterwards. He wasn't the most comfortable telling other people about his current living situation. More often than not, people would immediately begin to pity him, something he appreciated, but, again, was very uncomfortable with. What about it? Oh, I was just wondering, Issei stated, shrugging his shoulders nonchalantly as he redirected his gaze back to right in front of him, though his face had fallen noticeably. Seeing that his friend was willing to drop the subject, Izuku too decided to do the same thing and turn his attention out onto what was in front of him. Anyways, you want a piece of this? Hearing his friend say that, the former hero in training turned back to him, half expecting to see him holding yet another porn magazine, but what he found instead was actually touching about half of his yakisoba bread. Sure. Izuku replied as he took the offered piece of bread, which he honestly really needed, given the fact he wasn't able to bring back leftovers from his work for breakfast yesterday, due to it being his day off. Why? Hey, you're my friend, man. Do I really need a reason to give you some food when you clearly don't have any for yourself? Ah, right. He forgot that he very rarely ate anything at school. He usually just waited until he was home to eat something. Besides, I'm definitely not the sharpest guy in the world, but I can notice something like a friend of mine just never eating anything at lunch. For a while, Izuku stared at his brown-haired friend wide-eyed. Then, when he came back to his senses, he shook his head violently and smiled widely. Thanks, the inheritor of one for all, told his friend bashfully, glancing down at the ground under his feet as he did so. Hey, man, what do you think you're doing? Issei suddenly screamed out fearfully, confusing Izuku greatly. A guy has no right looking so adorable. That, in turn, made the green-haired one of them wipe said look off his face and flinched back in sheer horror. Sorry. If Izuku had to point towards one thing that set today's walk back from his part-time job as different from the rest, he'd immediately point to the sudden pulse of energy that suddenly sent a strong shiver down his spine like it was a cold wind. Which was impossible considering the date was only just now reaching the end of summer days and hot temperature days were still very prevalent. So, it was safe to say that the moment he felt the sudden distortion, he put himself on high alert for any dangers. I wonder what would have caused something like that? The former hero in training asked himself as he seized his sudden stoppage in the middle of the street and continued down the street he had been walking down prior to the disturbance, fingers cupped firmly around his chin. The only thing that came to mind was someone with a quirk revolving around either electricity or air pressure, but there was no way that was the case. Ever since he first arrived in this world, he had searched for any sign of a quirk existing outside of himself, and, consistently, he found nothing. So, the most logical explanation for the pulse of energy had to be something other than that, but what exactly? As he pondered that question to himself silently, the young man continued walking, his mind being so engrossed in his current thoughts that he had almost completely missed the entrance to his desired location, the same location that he always came to after his work, a park that just so happened to be located a few blocks away from his apartment building. He would come here at the end of every workday evening workout to relax his body and unwind his mind, which he did so mainly by sitting down on the same bench every day and watching time idly pass him by. He was sure that people, especially in the heavily work-oriented culture of Japan, would call such actions a waste of time, but after all the work he put in every day trying to keep up with his rent, school work, and vigilante duties, he needed some downtime. Even if it was just for 7 or so minutes at a time. silently berating himself for almost passing by his destination once again. Because of his overly focused mind, he stopped himself dead in his tracks and started scratching at the back of his head sheepishly, walking into the park while he did so. Why the show of embarrassment when there was no one around to point out his blunder? Well, honestly speaking, he himself wasn't sure of the reason. It was probably done completely out of force of habit, as he was used to doing so in the company of others great. Now he was beginning to become embarrassed about his own damn embarrassment. Man, what an awful paradox to be suddenly faced with. It was almost enough to make him want to run home, curl up into a corner, and hold his head in his hand. Finishing with that particular train of thought, Izuku made his way over to his usual bench, the closest one to the entrance he came in from, as he wanted to cut the time needed to get from his current sitting place to his home. Why? Mainly for efficiency's sake. Despite all that he said about needing some unwinding time after all the work he does, he didn't like to waste his time. In the end, he just wasn't a person capable of acting carefreely, it seems, even when he wanted to. As he sat silently in his usual roost, doing as he usually did and taking in the sweet, late summer atmosphere he remembered to appreciate while it was still present. Autumn was soon on the horizon, and with it, the green that permeated the park and reflected the yellowish orange of the setting sun would leave too and be replaced with all of the reds, yellows, oranges, and browns associated with the latter season. Now, he couldn't say that he disliked autumn at all. He was actually a much bigger fan of it than one would think, considering it in itself represented the slow death of his favorite one, summer, but he also couldn't say that he was necessarily looking forward to its arrival either. He just had very neutral thoughts toward the season in general. Well, at least with autumn, the humidity will be more bearable, he thought to himself, that literally being the only solace he could take in summer ending that he could come up with. He at least meant it in complete sincerity. Leaning back into the bench he was sitting on, he turned his attention up above to the orange and vaguely purple-stained sky and the sparse cloud coverage that was there at the time. He stayed like that for a while before having his reverie cut short by a woman's voice saying something that immediately caught his attention. "Please die for me." It was heard, spoken quietly, faintly even, but he most definitely heard those being spoken, and in his experience, though he was sure most people regardless of what they've experienced in the past would say the same, that was never a good sign of things to come. Head snapping over towards the direction in which Izuku had heard the voice come from, his vigilante instincts kicked into high gear and he threw himself off the bench, before then immediately sprinting towards it to see if someone's life was actually being threatened. He would have activated One for All and gotten there even faster, but he didn't want to give away the fact that he was there if the person who had uttered that threat was still there, as that could have led to a hostage situation, and those rarely ended well for anyone. Especially when heroes went charging into things without thinking things through first. If something horrible had happened to whoever that voice was threatening, the former hero in training would just have to do everything in his power to help the victim then and make up for his late arrival. That was all that he could do at this point, unfortunately. Heroes couldn't save everyone, but most importantly, the real ones, the real heroes, could push regret aside and do everything in their power to keep any more casualties from happening. It was a lesson that all aspiring heroes end up learning one way or another. Thankfully, Izuku himself didn't have to learn it the hard way. Unfortunately, the moment he saw who the person being told to do was, that lesson left his mind completely, and One for All full cowl began flaring up. As Issei fell back towards the ground in abject terror in what felt like slow motion, he couldn't help but take note of how wild a turn his day had taken. At the beginning, everything had been sunshine, boobies, and rainbows. It was almost as if he was floating up high in space, and nothing could bring him down. Why? Because he was going on a date with a girl. An honest-to-life girl with a body and everything. As someone who is almost universally hated by all the girls at his school, which pretty much meant the majority of the school, how could he not be happy? The date itself was even a success. He didn't get to touch any boobs, but that didn't keep him from feeling the most fulfilled that he's had since the day he found out he got accepted into Kuo Academy. Now, however, Issei's opinion on his day has changed drastically. No longer was he happy and satisfied. All he felt now was betrayed and confused. What had happened to Yuma? The girl who he had spent the last half day having fun with? How did that same, shy schoolgirl turn into a woman who could tell someone to die and smile like they won the lottery? Where did the really sexy clothes and the big, black, feathery wings come from? All of those questions ran through his mind as he fell, but quickly dispersed the moment his ass hit the brick, leaving only one question in his mind. Just what the hell is going on here? I really had fun today, you know. The sound of Yuma saying that ripped the perverted schoolboy from his thoughts and back to reality, though all that did was confuse him further. Just for a little while. To be able to go out with such an innocent child like yourself suddenly, she raised her left arm, looked and stared at her wrist, or more accurately, the pink scrunchie, which stood out immensely in the sea of black straps that she was currently wearing. He had gotten her as a gift with what even I could tell was faux fondness. I'll forever treasure this gift you've given me, so. Then, the person who called herself Yuma raised both her arms into the air, prompting a long, red, spear-like object to form in her hands. Still confused as to what exactly was going on, Issei raised a hand towards his date and called her name out, hoping she'd see the reason, Yuma-chan. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. The only thing that did was her suddenly closing the distance between him and her, doing so in what seemed like an instant. The king pervert's breathing hitched when he saw that. Was this the end for him? Was Yuma going to go through with what she said about him dying for her? If so, did that mean he was going to die before even getting a glimpse of his dream of becoming harem king? No, it can't end like this. Not in a place like this. Mental denials like that began to run rampant in his head as he flinched back in preparation for what seemed to be his inevitable fate. Not without me being able to place a single finger on Gremory-san's boobs. If only I had more time to. Then, from completely out of nowhere, an all too familiar voice cried out, "Get away from him." Hearing that, Issei opened his eyes, which he had instinctively closed when he flinched back in fear of death, and looked up from the ground to where Yuma should have been standing over her, but instead saw something he'd never see ever. Though, to be fair, that was mainly because he never thought it possible in the first place. There, moving through the air, as if he was in slow motion, was one Midoriya Izuku, and he was in the middle of absolutely kicking the shit out of Yuma's right shoulder. The scene that Issei just described, had only remained there, where he was staring up at it for just a second, before it disappeared entirely with the sound of human skin, hitting something that was clearly not skin, plastic if he had to guess. Leaving behind only a small trail of dust where Yuma had once been standing and his friend, who was glaring off in the direction the winged girl had flown off in and was radiating with some sort of electricity, behind. Midoriya, his friend's surname, slipped out of Issei's mouth the moment that his brain fully registered what was going on. Forcing himself up to his feet, he ran up to his still sparking friend and gripped him by the shoulder, shaking it as he yelled, "Dude, what the hell is going on?" Glancing at him, though Izuku never turned his head away from the direction where Yuma had been blasted not a few seconds ago, Issei received an answer that he absolutely dreaded hearing, "I don't know. Right now, I'm just as confused as to what's currently going on as you are." "Ah, really? But you have to know something. I mean, look at you." Issei did a quick motion over the entirety of Izuku's body with his hands. "You're literally flowing with electricity, man, and you're telling me you have no idea as to what's going on with the girl who suddenly sprouted wings. The fact that we can both do weird things doesn't mean anything." Suddenly, after seeing a flash of red light stream right by his face, Issei found himself feeling strangely weightless. Looking around, he found himself flying through the air on Izuku's shoulders, being carried fireman style. They didn't stay like that for long, as his green-haired friend soon landed and dropped him down on his ass like he was a sack full of potatoes. Taking note of his surroundings, the future harem king realized that he was at one of the park's two entrances. "Right now, I need you to get out of here and let me take care of this." "What?" That made Issei's eyes widen like they had never before. What was his friend saying? Was he suicidal or something? Staying here was the very last thing either of them should be doing. Even a dense idiot like himself understood that much. There were way too many boobs out in the world that he needed to touch before he died, and doing so wouldn't be the same if Izuku wasn't there to listen to him ramble about how each and every one of them felt. He wasn't going to let a friend of his just die. "Are you crazy, man? Let's just hurry up and get out of here while we still can." "Issei, I don't know what you did to get in this situation, but whoever that girl is clearly wants you dead," Izuku stated, his voice holding a strange steadiness that Issei had never heard before from his friend. Was this really the same boy who wigged out just barely glimpsing at pictures of a naked woman? How was he keeping his calm in a situation like this? Actually, how did he do any of that? The fountain was at the very center of the park, and he cleared that space in a single jump. She isn't going to stop jazzing until someone forces her to. Still. "Don't worry," Izuku interrupted him, but Issei found it really hard to protest when he saw his ever sheepish friend crack a smile that could light a nation. It was so bright and reassuring, which effectively stopped the pervert dead in his tracks. "I've got this." Then, clapping both his sparking hands on his shoulders, Izuku pulled the brown-haired boy up to his feet like it was nothing. "Now, go." Issei didn't need to be told twice, and for some reason, his words plus that smile were really persuasive. Then, he chose to believe in his friend's words and began to run in the direction he knew home was in, all the while hoping that his friend would be able to pick his phone up later tonight. In terms of bad situations, Izuku had definitely found himself in much worse situations in the past. Sure, the one that he was currently in right now was far from being ideal, but there was a time where the only way he could be effective in a combat situation was to break a part of his body over and over again, so there were certainly much stickier situations than this. The sound of a woman letting out a moan immediately put the young hero on edge. To think that there was a human in this town that could actually hurt me. I guess I have to be thankful though. I finally get to take on someone who can prove to be a challenge. As the words were uttered, a figure off in the distance turned the corner that Izuku himself had completely bypassed by activating one for all full cowl at 5% and jumping up at a somewhat steep angle. It took the young hero a moment to make out who it was due to the distance in between them, but every part of him already knew it was the same woman who had threatened to say and had him on the ground with that strange spear raised over her head. Just what exactly are you, Dark Angel-san? That was the only thing that ran through his head as Izuku stared down his approaching enemy, who was already beginning to make a new spear for her to throw at me. Some sort of quirk user. No, I've already established that quirks didn't exist in this world, so this has to be something else entirely. She just said something about a human being actually able to hurt her, so that must mean she's not human. Some sort of angel then. But if she's an angel, why are her wings black? And why was she trying to kill Issei? Izuku was forcibly ripped away from his thoughts when he saw the figure throw another one of her spears, prompting the currently costumeless hero to side hop off to the left to dodge, using his quirk at 5% to help make sure that he really did dodge the weapon. The moment he had put himself up in the air, however, Izuku knew that he had just played right into his enemy's hand and found that, as his eyes tracked the spear hurtling towards him, he hadn't paid any attention to the person who had thrown it. Who had probably begun to fly towards him with another spear in hand a second after her initial attack. The scantily clad woman was near him by the time the vigilante noticed, but thankfully, she wasn't moving nearly fast enough for him to not be able to react. Either she wasn't able to, or didn't want to, but whatever one it was, Izuku moved to keep her from getting anywhere closer to him. Pumping one for all to 20% in solely his arms, the young man brought both his hands together right as the dark-haired woman got an arm's length of him, causing the high-speed air that both appendages moving at high speed had generated to slap together, causing a mighty explosion to occur right as his fingertips, all the while yelling out a certain hero's catchphrase, smash. His counter to his opponent's sudden charge was a move that he learned just a few weeks before it happened. As it turned out, even while operating at only 20% of its full capacity, One for All still made his body move fast enough to create hellaciously powerful wind, or rather, fast enough for moving air to move people's body backwards, despite having their heels stuck firmly in the ground. With a wave of a hand, Izuku could generate such power, and upon realizing that, he then proceeded to figure out that two of such waves of rushing air molecules coming together at a certain point in space caused very powerful, short-burst explosions that shot out in front of him. The only real problem with using this method of attack was that they, more often than not, tended to knock him on his butt more often than, which, when compared to literally forcing your arms and legs to shatter, wasn't an all too bad for a drawback. But Izuku saw it as a bad enough one for him to rule using it out of the question, unless the situation itself made it possible for him to use it without exposing himself. Usually, those kinds of situations closely resembled the one Izuku had just been in, where he was in a place where movement options were limited and he had an enemy bearing down on his neck at the same time. Unlike those times, however, he chose to do it while in midair, and he had never done it like that before, so he was more than marginally surprised to find it ended so well for him. After he had created that explosion, the former hero in training had been sent flying straight back, but thankfully, his body had been positioned in a way that made it so that his feet met the ground before and other body part did when his momentum died, allowing him to use the soles of his shoes to bring himself to a stop. The same, however, couldn't be said about his opponent, who had been sent rolling across the ground by his counterattack before eventually coming to a stop with her stomach side down. Did that do it? Izuku asked himself as he purposefully fell forwards. Catching himself, he was in a position that made it so that the palms of hands, which had gotten redder than his cheeks got when talked to by a member of the opposite sex and stung a fair deal, were flat against a brick under him. That only caused the pain in his hands to worsen significantly, but it also got him in a stance where he'd be most ready for a sudden attack from his downed opponent, which he fully expected. No. There's no way she would go down that easily. She has to be. Right as that thought crossed his mind, the vigilante noticed a shift in his opponent's body and immediately moved to be anywhere than where he was currently standing, which was a good idea since the moment he moved. He just barely avoided getting run through by a spear that his downed opponent had somehow managed to launch from her face-down position. This time only going at 5%, Izuku launched himself towards a nearby tree and began bouncing off everyone in the vicinity at random, making sure to switch up the variation of trees that he bounced between. If I keep doing this, he began to think, as he watched the scantily clad angel begin to rise from her place on the ground, her head very clearly trying to keep up with his movements. "Quit it with all your bouncing around and fight me face to face, you worm," the woman screamed as she formed another spear in her hand. "It'll be much harder for her to hit me with those spears of hers and when she's fully up to her feet." Just as he thought that, the young hero saw the almost murderer put her feet under her, which prompted to kick off a tree at 15% and ride at his opponent's back, turning his body in midair as he neared. When he was finally close enough to do so, Izuku guided his shin right to the area between the angel's shoulder blades and forced her to the ground under his leg with his momentum. The angel under him let out a grunt as they felt and immediately began to struggle against the hold he had on her by pushing against the ground with her palms, but Izuku kept her down by decreasing 1 for all to 10% and applying pressure to the area that rested between her shoulders. "Get off of me, you insolent," the defeated person began to scream as she continued to struggle against him, but Izuku cut her off forcefully. "Tell me why you were trying to kill Issei." The question left his mouth the same way it did every time he had to squeeze information out of a villain on the fly, which basically meant that it came off as louder and more angry than his usual tone of voice. Izuku got no immediate response from his interrogatee, but he did eventually. All it took was another 5 minutes of keeping her restrained in patience before she finally decided to cease struggling and talk to him. "You want to know why I wanted to kill your friend? Fine. I'll tell you." Izuku's eyes narrowed at the back of her head when he heard her trail off mid-sentence. That was when he noticed something black, leathery, and shaking enter his peripheral vision. Eyes widening in recognition, Izuku instinctively moved his entire body to his left and watched as a spear just barely grazed the side of his head. Unfortunately, his moving caused the vigilante to loosen the pressure he had on his opponent's back, and that allowed her to lift her wings and flap them hard. The lift created was enough to get both of their weights into the air, and since he was already moving to the left due to his dodge, he rolled off her back and onto the ground very easily, landing on his back with a thud. Knowing subconsciously that the angel already had a spear in her right hand, Izuku quickly rolled himself over and pushed himself in the direction that he knew she couldn't throw in, directly under her, doing so at 20%. The world, after that action, felt like it was moving in slow motion, which was ultimately a good thing as it allowed him to watch as he flew directly under his flying opponent, who was looking in the direction that he should have been. Knowing that this was an opportunity to get the upper hand on his opponent, the vigilante shifted his body weight so that he was slowly rotating to his left and upwards, which led him to landing on the soles of his shoes. Body already completely wrapped in 1 for all's energy, Izuku launched himself into the air the moment feet touched ground and reached where his opponent was flying in about a second, and then some. Slipping his arms around the woman's waist, which was actually very hard to do since he was both moving at high speed and the fact that she had wings to avoid, Izuku dragged the girl with him as he continued a good 5 feet over the park's trees. What the woman in his grip began to ask, but was forced to stop when Izuku began to rotate himself in midair. "How did you?" Waiting until the both of them reached the peak of their ascent, the supposed symbol of peace released the grip he had on the angel so that she was closer to the ground than he was. Rearing his right arm back, Izuku put all of 20% 1 for all into it and began to call out the name of a move that he himself came up with. "Gusto?" Then, instead of sending his fist out to the damage, Izuku bent his arm and slammed his elbow right where the angel's wings met. Elbow party. With that, the angel shot right into the ground and landed with enough force to create a small crater where she ended up. Ria's Gremory watched the battle that went on between the green-haired boy and the fallen angel with curiosity, though it'd be a stretch to refer to it as a battle with how easily the prior was dealing with the latter. Sure, the fallen had forced the boy to dodge her attacks every once in a while, but that was the full extent of the fight. Ara, look at him move." The person standing next to the president of Kuo Academy's occult club, Himejima Akeno, said offhandedly as the boy he was talking about smashed the angel into the ground. "I'm glad that you decided to see why the fallen angel hadn't killed Issei yet. Being able to see this." "Akeno," Rias called out to her VP and best friend as the young man slowly fell to the ground, body still radiating that same energy that seemed to give him his power, a power that she didn't recognize for the life of her. The aforementioned friend didn't hesitate in tearing her eyes away from the spectacle going on in front of her and towards Rias, asking, "Yes, but you? Doesn't that boy look familiar to you? I think I've seen him around at school, but I can't place a finger on what his name is." "Ah, now that you mention it, I believe I've seen him around school before too. Izuku, if I remember correctly. He's a second-year student who's in the same class as Issei." He transferred to Kuo a few weeks ago. Ah, that explains why the two were acting so close earlier. They must be friends. A satisfied smile crossed Ria's lips as that mystery solved itself, but it only lasted a second before a frown replaced it as the other mysteries that revolved around the situation re-entered her mind. Still, that only makes me wonder how he managed to slip under our radars for so long even more. You think we would have noticed him if he had a power like that the entire time? Oh, I take it that this little display has caused your interest in him to peak then? Keno's voice took a turn towards the suggestive when she said that, which meant that part of her was incoming, and that forced Ria's to scramble all of her brain cells to fight against that. Mine certainly has, at the very least. I wonder if hanging around Issei means that he's a pervert as well. Deciding that it was probably best to ignore the second part of her friend's statement entirely, Ria's just answered the question that was posed to her. Has my interest in him grown? Of course, it has. He's a human who can hit as hard as a rook but still maneuver like a knight. If it turned out that he could use magic as well, he'd pretty much be a queen in a human's body. A valuable piece indeed if we were able to convince him to join us, but what about Issei? How are you going to get him to join us now? It should be easy enough. He now knows about the supernatural, and he'll probably be paranoid that people are out to get him. We get him alone, and between the two of us, I'm sure we can convince him to join the occult research club. Hey, why is he picking the fallen angel up? What was the president of the OCR, Occult Research Club, referring to when she said that? Well, she was referring to the fact that Izuku, after looking at the unconscious woman and looking around him frantically with an obvious nervousness to him, had lifted the fallen angel up off the ground bridal style and activated his power. Soon enough, the green-haired boy in what looked to be the uniform to some restaurant launched himself into the air and out of the sight of the two great ladies of Kuo who were watching from the bushes the entire time. Izuku was lacking in a lot of places. Adequate height, social aptitude when dealing with the opposite gender, and a normal childhood were some of those things, but there had never been a time in his life where he felt as though he lacked the ability to plan things through. Actually, even before acquiring his quirk from All Might and he learned how to put the plans that popped up in his head into action, he felt as though his problem-solving ability had been way above that of any other teenager. So, that's why his current predicament was stressing him out so much. Currently, the inheritor of One for All was using the quirk entrusted to him to jump from rooftop to rooftop, his destination being the roof of a building that was near the edge of Kuo town. Having used it as a place to continue training his control with One for All many times in the past, he knew that it would be private enough to hold a conversation with the person that he was currently carrying in his arms. Though, after everything that had happened, Izuku felt kind of remiss to even call her a person, seeing as she had sprouted a pair of wings and started throwing around spears of what he assumed to be light. Seriously, Izuku asked himself as he glanced down at the unconscious girl that had attacked Issei, still in utter disbelief as to what just happened. What are you, Angel-san? As Izuku gazed upon the unconscious girl in his arms, who he had decided to call Angel-san in absence of an actual name, he couldn't help but notice one thing. She was extremely, ridiculously pretty. Really, it'd be more accurate of him to say that she was downright, drop-dead gorgeous. Her face was perfectly heart-shaped, her skin was pale and flawless, and her long black hair, that seemed to just go on and on, didn't seem to have a single imperfect centimeter to it. Everything about her just seemed so perfect, so utterly unreal, that he could hardly even believe she existed, a fact that wasn't helped at all by the two wings that were sprouting out from her back. Just what in the world is going on? Izuku asked himself as he used One for All to launch himself to yet another rooftop, there being a clear frustration in his voice. Normally, he was a rather hard person to irritate. His generally calm and understanding nature made sure of that, but his current predicament was simply a special case. To say the very least, his entire world has been turned upside down by the sudden appearance of Angel-san. One moment, his life was that of a somewhat normal, entirely self-sufficient high school student just trying to get by, and the next, he was fighting off the angel that was trying to murder his friend. Absolutely nothing about what he had just gone through made sense to him in any way. Who was this girl? Why does she have the power to sprout wings and make spears of light? Why does she want to say dead? Were there any more people like her? Those were all things that ran through his head as he continued to make his way to his desired location, body moving solely on autopilot at this point. Izuku frowned deeply as he dashed across a nondescript roof, his frustration growing with every question that popped up in his mind. Thankfully, he wasn't too far off from his training spot, and when he got there, he'd have the opportunity to ask Angel-san each and every one. When consciousness finally returned to Rainer, she felt as though a truck had crashed into the small of her back with how badly it hurt and ached. Naturally arching to try and relieve herself of said agony, she found the act to be extremely difficult, so difficult, in fact, that it was actually impossible to do so without great effort. Why? Well, the fact that her entire body had been wrapped up in thick steel chains gave her a hint. What the hell? Was the first thing that came to mind when she saw the attempt to restrain her. Head shooting up to her current surroundings, she found that she was sitting in the center of what the humans called an underground parking garage. Though the underground part was mainly speculation by her. The ground under was asphalt, and the pillars that ran up to the roof were made of cement, but she couldn't see a single sign of an outside world, which told her that they were currently underground. Where in the world? How did I? Being fueled by mounting frustration, the fallen angel shut her eyes hard and grit her teeth with the same amount of force as she looked back in her mind, trying to figure out what happened to get her in this position. One moment she was in the park about to kill her target, then some boy. It was then when Rainer's eyes widened in realization. It was that boy that did this to her. The one with the wild green hair, it had to be, but how could she have lost to a human? It didn't make any sense to her. No, wait, she stopped herself, eyes widening as she realized something. That power of his. Yes, the power that the boy had displayed, the one that manifested itself in the form of electricity flowing throughout his body. From what the fallen angel could tell, it was something that enhanced both his power and speed significantly, though at what rate seemed to fluctuate as the fight went on. There were times where he bolted around faster than her eyes could follow, and his strikes, as she stated earlier, felt like he was hitting her with a truck. She immediately thought that it was some sort of sacred gear, one that she had never seen before in the past, but that really didn't help her explain anything at all. Actually, it only spawned more questions for her to have to answer, though those were the last things on her mind at the moment. Maybe he was a part of some devil's peerage. No, he didn't give off the telltale signs of one, maybe. Damn it, damn it, damn it. Rainer cursed to herself as she pushed against the chains that restrained her with her arms and wings, planning on using the superior strength of a fallen angel to break them. The cursing didn't do anything but throw more dirt on the thoughts that were threatening to surface, though that was all she needed at the moment. After all that had happened, her situation was far from ideal, and so, she needed to improve it. First off, she needed to come up with a list of priorities, which, in the end, was actually a really easy thing to do. At the very top of the list was breaking free from her restraints, next came finding and mutilating the boy that did this to her, and after that, there was getting back to the church so she could regroup and go on to mutilate the target that she just barely whiffed on killing, Issei. It'd all be easy too. She just needed to get the first step over and done with first. Unfortunately, even after several minutes of struggling, the chains didn't give at all. They didn't even shift an inch, they were bound so tight around her. She even tried to create a spear of light to cut through the chain, but her hands were tied separately from her body and angled in a way where she couldn't touch her bindings. Seriously, what in the… Ah, you're finally awake, Angel-san. The fallen angel's blood somehow froze and began to boil the moment she heard those words were spoken. She recognized it immediately, despite only having heard it once before, and hearing it again prompted her to snap her head up towards where it had come from. When she did so, she found no one other than the very boy she was grousing about, and simply laying eyes on him made her want to tear his eyes out of his skull. Though, for some reason, seeing her rage, which had to be pretty plain for him to see given that her face was literally twisted in it, made him let out a sheepish chuckle and start scratching the back of his neck. "Ha, I suppose I should have expected you to react like this." Upon hearing that, a lot of possible responses ran through Rainer's mind, all of them being rather profane in nature, as her mind was currently racing with fury, but a question ended up slipping from her mouth before any of them. She kinda wished that it didn't though. It was way too shaky sounding for her liking. "What are you?" The question still came out sounding with a fair amount of outrage in it, though most of it was covered up by the large amounts of suspicion and genuine curiosity the fallen angel felt towards her captor. There was more of the prior than the latter though. What exactly do you mean by that?" Even when faced with the wall of negative emotion that was her face, the boy's sheepishness didn't leave him, though he at least seemed taken aback by the hostility. "You beat me." Rainer lowered her head to face the ground as she, unable to stop herself now that her emotions were raging just as most fallen angels did, and uttered the words that weighed so heavy on her pride, a feeling that was only exacerbated when she saw how non-threatening the boy looked. Did she lose to him of all people? The way he was now, the worm didn't look like he could hurt a fly, so how? "What peerage are you from?" What are you? Don't you dare play with me." The words burst out from Rainer's mouth with more venom than even the shiftiest of devil's tongue, raising her head to face the reason for all her anger. "Powerful sacred gear or not, there's no way a mere human worm like yourself would be able to beat someone like me. So, tell me the name of your peerage, devil. Citres. Gremories. Which one is it?" As each and every word slipped out from her mouth, Rainer could feel her fury give way into something else, something that, despite being dormant most of the time, came rearing its ugly head every once in a while. Thankfully, the devil's face had done something to make it so that a rage bounced back like a wildfire in the wind. It fell, almost like he pitied her. How dare he? I'm sorry, Angel-san, but I think you just, as the boy was saying that another voice cut through the air, stopping both him and her completely. Ah, there you are, cunt. Turning to where the voice had come from, Rainer was faced with the one person, or should she say, devil, that she really didn't want to see. You're a rather hard person to find, you know that. Gremory-san. Of course, Izuku knew the name of the red-headed beauty that stood before him. There wasn't a soul in Kuo Academy who didn't. She was the creme de la creme. The tip of the very top in terms of social status and popularity. If someone didn't know of her at the very least, it was very much akin to being back in his homeworld and not knowing who All Might was. People would look at them as if they were brought up by a pack of wolves in the wild, and it wasn't without good reason. Just like All Might had been the greatest hero in the world, Gremory was known as the greatest woman among all the students of Kuo Academy. Be it in terms of looks, social skills, or her general personality, she easily outshined any other in their school. If that wasn't enough to get the point that she was an overall perfect human being across, she even ranked second in the terms of her exam scores, only being seconded by Citri Sauna, the Academy's student council president and known genius. Izuku had never actually interacted with a girl before, but in just looking at her for the first time, he could tell that at least a third of what everyone at school was saying was true. She was stunning. Absolutely beautiful. Probably the closest to perfect human being the boy had ever seen in terms of appearance alone. The flawless porcelain skin that framed her perfectly proportioned face seemed to radiate with a certain sort of glow, even under the dim fluorescent lights of the abandoned underground parking garage that they were currently standing in. Her long, straight hair ran all the way down to the lower part of her knees and was a shade of red so deep and vibrant that the former hero in training couldn't help but assume that it had been dyed. She stood impressively tall, though he may have just thought that because she looked to be at least a couple centimeters taller than he did, which put a major emphasis on her long legs that were pretty much exposed due to the shortness of her skirt. Wait, stop thinking about that. The now vigilante chided himself as he brought his eyes up and away from places that he knew Issei would care far too much about. There are more important things to be worrying about right now. What are you doing? He began to stutter out a question for the girl, but he stopped himself when he realized something that made him tense up. Wait, you know who I am? As Izuku had said earlier, they had never interacted with one another once during all his time at Kuo Academy, and he was far from someone who was known throughout the school like Gremory was, or at the very least, he thought he was. So, how did she know who he was? Also, how did she even know he was here, to begin with? He had been trying his best to make sure no one saw him. In response, the crimson-haired beauty simply cocked her to the side, as if what he just said made no sense whatsoever, but after a second or two of silence between them, her brilliant blue eyes widened in what Izuku assumed to be realization. Oh, right, there's no way that you would know about that, she muttered to herself, raising her hand in a loosely balled fist to her mouth as she did so. Suddenly, she planted the back of her wrists onto her hips and smiled at him. Well, anyways, don't mind that for right now, I'll explain everything later. And, just like that, his questions were brushed away, as if they didn't matter. Great. For now, I think that there's a certain elephant in the room that we need to talk about. When the topmost lady in all of Kuo had said, her eyes shifted over towards Izuku's right, immediately giving the green-haired boy an idea as to what she was referring to. That had thrown him for a loop for sure. Of course, the dimension hopper had expected the topic of conversation to eventually shift over to the girl that sat a few feet behind him. The entire upper portion of her body had been completely wrapped up in chains, and the only parts of her that were visible were parts that were, well, visible. He couldn't help but think that the entire scene looked like something out of one of Issei's fantasies. Shaking the thoughts out of his mind before they backfired, which had been a lesson that was learned from both Issei and Mineta back in his world, Izuku glanced back at the woman who had tried to kill his friend. And instantly took notice of the look of pure malice that adorned her facial features as she glared at Gremory. That was far from a good sign in his books. That look, Izuku thought to himself as he quickly turned his attention back towards Gremory, who seemed unfazed by the look that the dark-winged angel was giving her. Now that I think about it, didn't Angel-san mention a Gremory earlier? Alright, what did you want to talk about, Gremory-san? The inheritor of One for All internally cringed at the shakiness and clear distrust that was present in his voice when he started talking. Thankfully, he was able to somewhat disguise it as he continued, but the apprehension was most definitely evident. Izuku couldn't help the emotions that were leaking into his voice, though. There was definitely something different about the woman standing before him. What exactly it was, he didn't know, but it most definitely had something to do with the word devil. The glare that Rainer was currently sending the woman that she knew as Ria's Gremory, a woman that she had never wanted to meet face to face ever, much less after she was beaten by a human of all things. To her own credit though, the said woman was a member of the infamous Gremory clan, one of the last remaining 72 original devil families, known as the Crimson Ruin Princess by her peers, so her being afraid was honestly pretty justified. Honesty didn't make the Fallen feel any better about what was going on, though. Actually, it made things even worse for her, as her pride made it almost impossible for it all to swallow. First off, she had been beaten by a human and now, the area's ruling devil knew about her, a detail that made everything a trillion times worse. First off, I must say that I'm impressed with how you dealt with the fallen angel sitting behind you, the red-headed devil began, crossing her arms as she did so. There was now a smug air surrounding the girl that made Rainer want to slap her head off that pretty little neck. Even for someone with sacred gear, you should have had some sort of trouble, but from what I saw, you beat her pretty easily. For what was probably the 100th time during the start of their conversation, the human, who she now knew, was named visibly tensed at the mention of the fight. It looks like her assumption that he was a devil with a rare sacred gear was off the mark, damn it. You know about that? He asked, stepping a step back as he did so. How? Oh, I watched. Gremory cut the boy off before he could finish the obvious question to be asked. From where Rainer sat, she could tell that the devil did try to reassure the boy that there was nothing wrong, but it seemed to only have made him even tenser. You were watching, how suddenly, the green-haired worm's eyes widened in realization as he cut himself off. Wait, doesn't that mean that you were watching the entire time? The devil blinked at the sudden intensity of the boy's voice before then nodding and curtly answering, not the entire thing, no. I only really caught wind of what was going on right as you jumped into the fray, so I wasn't able to see everything that happened. I was still able to grasp the gist of what was going on, however. That was when Gremory suddenly shifted her blue gaze over towards Rainer, and the Fallen instantly felt a chill run down her veins in response to the ice that was present in the devil's eyes. And from what I saw, I think that the Fallen sitting behind you needs to be reminded of exactly whose territory she's on right now. Fallen. Territory. Like an idiot, the boy repeated every keyword that was present in what Gremory had just said, which would have irritated Rainer greatly, if not for the fact that she was currently too busy glaring daggers into the devil that he was repeating. What are you? Oh again, the devil blinked and stared it owlishly, before then reaching up and cupping the tip of her chin, as she looked down at the ground in what seemed to be contemplation. It seems that you really don't know what's going on. Well, we can just save that explanation for a later time, cunt. Then, all of a sudden, Gremory's eyes raised themselves up from the ground and pointed themselves back at Dot. For now, just know that there are currently forces at work that are beyond your current understanding, she began, shifting her eyes over to Rainer as she spoke, and that those same forces dictate that a certain someone here gets punished for what they've done. Rainer's eyes widened at the declaration and then immediately narrowed in response to what she perceived as a threat. Surprisingly enough, even though she opened her mouth to retort, her voice wasn't the one that she heard respond. Punishment. The green-haired worm in front of her whimpered back in what sounded like surprise, which confused the fallen angel, because didn't he bring her here in some way? Why else would he chain her up and bring her to a secluded location like this? What do you mean, Gremory-san? What I mean is that she knew exactly whose territory she was on and what our rules are when you're on it, and yet, she still found it acceptable to try and kill a human, Gremory explained to the boy in possibly the most condescending tone Rainer had ever heard in her life. From where I'm standing, the devil then turned to look at the chained Fallen. I think that's more than enough reason for me to execute you right here and now, Fallen. Wait, execute. Hold. And from where I'm standing. Thanks to all of the anger that was running through her veins due to not being able to get a word into the conversation the two were having about her, Rainer was able to violently ignore the fact that she, in fact, wasn't standing. I think that you exist is a good enough reason for me to want to rip your head off of your shoulders, so I suppose we're even, devil. Suddenly, a new voice cut into the conversation and drew both the human and the fallen angel's attention towards where it had come from. Just then, a new face appeared on the scene, and Rainer felt her heart stop in her chest when she watched her literally step out from the shadows to reveal herself. That's quite a lot of big talk coming from the one who's all wrapped up in chains. Just like she had with Gremory, Rainer was immediately able to recognize who the newcomer was. The long, dark black hair and deep violet eyes were tip-offs enough. She was known as the Crimson Ruin Princess's right hand and queen, the priestess of thunder, Himejima Akeno. Oh, and speaking of those chains, the dark-haired devil then glanced over at the boy, who looked just as terrified as he was when Grimmery revealed herself, a feeling that only seemed to be intensified when she smiled at him all of a sudden. I must admit that I really didn't see you as the kind of person to be so good at tying people up. She then proceeded to strut over to the poor boy, lean into his personal space, and whisper into his ear, "Would mind sharing your technique with me?" "Alright, that's enough teasing, Keno," Grimmery eventually spoke up, stopping her queen dead in her tracks. "If you keep going, I'm afraid that you might give the poor boy a heart attack." Himejima asked, confused by the sudden interruption, but then seemed to understand, after pulling away from the boy, that she was supposedly making so uncomfortable. Rainer couldn't actually tell from where she was sitting, but as the newcomer pulled away from him, she found that true to the Crimson Ruin Princess's words, looked like he was made of stone, he was so petrified. "Oh, well, I guess you're right." She offered the living statue an apologetic smile as she chuckled to herself sheepishly. "Sorry about that, Kun. I got a little carried away. I'll be sure to take it easy on you for now." "For now," repeated in his dismay. Grimmery, probably sensing that she was about to lose control of the situation once again, cleared her throat and gained the attention of the entire room, and when all eyes were on her, she stated, "Alright, so back to the topic at hand." Her blue eyes once again found their way back to Rainer, who had been stewing in her own rage on the floor as she, for a second time, took a backseat when it came to her being the focus of the conversation. "You, what to do with you, I wonder?" The crimson-haired devil walked over to the chained-up fallen angel and looked down at her, crossing her arms over her chest. As she did so, "Logically speaking, I should probably kill you right now before you can cause me any more trouble." "Damn, this isn't good," Rainer thought to herself, as she glared up at the devil who was obviously doing her damnedest to be condescending towards her. There was no doubt in her mind that Grimmery could just kill her now and be done with it. First off, Grimmery was completely right to say that the fallen angel had transgressed against the devil's ruling over the area by trying to kill Issei, and to make things worse for her, she was more than sure that none of her race would be willing to risk war by backing actions. "How do I get out of this? Come on, think. How do I?" Grimmery-san. Suddenly, the boy decided to speak up. He did so timidly with his eyes being pointed down towards the ground and index fingers pressing against each other, but he decided to speak for whatever reason. "I don't really know what's going on right now with these higher powers, devils, fallen angels, or whatever you were talking about, but, Then, with no warning, he lifted his head and looked at the Crimson Ruin Princess with a conviction that Rainer hadn't reared its head since she and he fought. "Even if she did try to kill Issei, I'm not going to let you kill this girl." Silence rang in the air after the boy had said that, and frankly, while the two devils looked at the boy, as if they were shocked, no one in the room was more surprised by what he had said than Rainer herself. She had tried to murder someone who was very clearly a friend of his, and yet the boy, for whatever reason, decided that he did not want her dead. Why? It made absolutely no sense to her, no matter how many times she went over it in her head. Himejima suddenly broke the silence that sat in between the four of them as she said, "This certainly makes things a lot more interesting." Izuku submerged himself deeper into the warm water of the bath that he had made himself and let out an exasperated sigh. Glancing around at the simple white walls of his small apartment bathroom, he attempted to keep his already overclocked mind from wandering back to the thoughts that overworked it, to begin with by looking at and taking note of everything that sat in the room. There was the bath shower hybrid that he was currently sitting in, an amenity that he hadn't expected when he first rented the apartment due to the rather apparent age of the building. He expected there to be a shower, but to have a combination of both. That was actually a pleasant surprise. Everything else in his bathroom, aka his toilet and sink, were much less of a pleasant surprise due to the fact that they were both generic looking. They did, however, look sort of new and modern, which was a plus in his book. "Damn it," Izuku thought to himself, as he raised his head up from the water and turned it to look straight up at his ceiling. "This isn't going to work." Thinking back to all that he learned in the past few hours, the boy couldn't help but wonder what happened to the world around him. To say that the last couple hours for him had sent his equilibrium rocketing into space would have been an understatement. Actually, it'd be pretty accurate to say that him sitting somewhere that was even vaguely familiar to him felt like a godsend. Devils, fallen angels, what in the world am I supposed to do with all this information? The former hero in training asked himself, before then nearly jumping out of his skin when he heard a feminine shriek and metallic clanging suddenly come from behind his bathroom door. Crap. She's already awake. Thanks for watching this video. Story is over. If you really enjoy this video, like, subscribe, and comment down below, and turn on that bell notification. And also check out the playlist that I have created and enjoy. Link is in the description. See you in the next video. Goodbye.